Hello everyone. In today's session, let's talk about Amazon ECS over Docker Swarm. Earlier we have learned about Docker engine and then followed by Docker Swarm cluster. Now I need to know why we have to go for ECS of AWS service instead of using Docker Swarm. To understand that, we need to know the limitations of Docker Swarm cluster. As part of it, here we have listed some of the features to compare between Docker Swarm and Amazon ECS. First, let us understand about license. Docker Swarm is an open source tool when you compare with ECS. If I need to access ECS service, first I need to create an AWS account. I have to configure the billing and then have to use ECS. What about infra? I can configure Docker Swarm cluster on-premises environment or in the cloud as well. Whereas Amazon ECS, we have two components. One is controller, which will be managed by AWS and that will be spinned up on EC2. We don't have access. Whereas compute plane, we can configure on EC2, that is AWS data center, or we can use serverless architecture like Fargate, or we can integrate our on-premises compute plane environment to the ECS cluster as well. We can choose according to our requirement. We have that particular flexibility. Now, what about scalability? We have to manually configure for Docker Swarm or we need to use third-party tool. Whereas in ECS, we can integrate CloudWatch alarm with auto scaling group so that whenever the alarm gets triggered, I can increase the number of nodes in the cluster or I can decrease the number of nodes, which comes under auto scaling group. What about creating a cluster? In Docker Swarm, we have to manually configure the multiple regions to spin up the cluster. You have to pick one data center from one region, another data center from another region, and you have to spread your cluster across the regions. You have to manually configure that. Whereas in Amazon ECS, you can select the option. Automatically, it will spin up the cluster in across the regions or within the region in multiple availability zones. That particular feature we have in AWS. What about security? We have to manually configure, which comes under user configuration in Docker Swarm. Whereas in Amazon ECS, I can use IAM service like users, roles, and policies for authentication and for authorization. What about load balancing? In Docker Swarm, though we have published our application, but still we have to configure external load balancer to split the traffic or to distribute the traffic. Whereas in ECS, we can integrate elastic load balancer of AWS service and then we can configure either application load balancer or network load balancer. Application load balancer comes under layer 7 and network load balancer comes under layer 4. We can choose any one of them based on our requirement. What about monitoring? We have to use some third-party tools like ELK or other components to monitor the metrics of your Docker Swarm. Whereas in Amazon ECS, we have a service called CloudWatch. This CloudWatch will monitor the metrics of your cluster and the applications as well. It can monitor both of them. Then what about application logs or the cluster logs? We have to configure third-party tool in Docker Swarm. But in AWS, we can use CloudWatch service. It has monitoring and logging as well. What is the benefit of it? If something goes wrong with the application, though your application got deleted from the cluster, I can see the logs of that particular application in the CloudWatch and I can understand or I can analyze what went wrong, why the application has went down. Is it because of some failure? I can analyze and then I can do some particular fix in the code level or in the deployment level. For that purpose, we use logging. The next one is cost. Here it is free of cost in Docker Swarm because I don't need to purchase any license key under open source. Whereas in AWS ECS, we have to pay the charges as we have used, which is called as pay as you go model. You have to pay only for what you have used. We are not creating only ECS. Underlying that, we will be using some elastic IP address, VPC network, NAT gateway, and data transfer charges, there will be many other things behind the scenes. So we have to pay the bill for the entire resources what we have used. That is called as pay as you go model. What about learning? It is not too complex to learn or to use or to manage Docker Swarm cluster. It is pretty easy. If you have basic understanding on Docker engine, creating a Docker Swarm cluster is not a complex task. It is straightforward. Just you need to run a simple few commands. Whereas Amazon ECS, you need to have the understanding of the cluster, how it works, what we need to configure, what are the prerequisites. I need to learn about VPC, I need to learn about IAM, I need to learn about auto scaling group, I need to learn about CloudWatch, I need to learn about Elastic Load Balancer if I have integrated for a production environment. So you need to learn some other services as well in order to form a proper ECS cluster for production environment. For a testing, other services may not be needed. Few services are sufficient. But what about production level? We need to learn them as well. Finally, the utilization. Docker Swarm cluster will consume less amount of resources of the infra. Whereas in Amazon ECS, it will consume more when you compare with Docker Swarm. But it is negligible. Now these are the important points as part of the differences why we have to go for Amazon ECS compared to Docker Swarm cluster. It is useful, but it is a limitations what we have. But if you want some advanced features like monitoring, load balancing, logging, and all these particular concepts, you have to go for Amazon ECS. In the next sessions, we will talk about what is Amazon ECS and why we have to use it. That's all for this particular session. Thank you.